Hey, buddy. How's it going?
Doing well. How are you doing?
Good. It's good to see you got a haircut.
That's right. Today, 5.
5:30. Well, welcome back. This is another scripture breakdown. We took a very long break. I wanted to do this like weekly, but life, your life has been crazy and my life has been crazy, but um we may have a little more free time on our hands in the next few weeks, so maybe we can churn some of these out. What do you
Right.
think?
What other good way to spend your quarantine time than talk about the Psalms? So
That's right. Well, the elephant in the room is all of the cancellations of quizzing and everything else, and it hurts, and it hurts me a lot. I know it hurts you. I know it hurts a lot of people, but in the grand scheme of things, we just have to keep a good perspective and realize how important it is that we don't think so much about quizzing, but just make it so much about quizzing, but make it so much more about the people that can be really affected by this virus. Like my daughter, in fact, is high risk with her condition. She has a I don't know if it's not asthma, but she had RSV and she's had a lot of struggles with her respiratory stuff. So she may be high risk. So stuff like that makes me take it very seriously. How are
definitely.
you doing with everything?
We're doing good. LSU is closed. I'm sure, like a lot of other universities. Public accounting is still in full swing. So tax deadlines are still tax deadlines right now. But other than that, everything else kind of shut down in Louisiana. So Louisiana is actually the number 3 state in coronavirus cases per capita.
Wow.
So
Whew.
not a good record for Louisiana, but hopefully we'll get it calmed down.
Oh, well, I work for the city government, and I work in IT, and we support police and our firefighters and stuff, so we can't just stop. I mean, we have to
Yeah.
support them. So there's an election tomorrow, the primaries in Illinois tomorrow, and my wife is an election judge, so like life's going on, and we're just kind of, having faith and
Do
praying
it.
and taking all the precautions we can. But
Wash your hands.
wash your hands. That's absolutely true. Um, but yeah, how did you feel when you found out about BQE?
I like sadly kind of thought it was coming. I mean, people like I had Sister Monica Bell who goes to our church. She's a nurse, and she kind of like saw it coming with flight cancellations to Austin for us, and then just like the possibility of interstate travel being closed in the next couple of weeks. So yeah, I definitely kind of saw it coming. I that still did not soothe the actual effect of hearing about the cancellation. I got like my phone started like blowing up
Mine too.
after, after the cancellation happened. So, but it's a sad time. But I'm sure the youth ministries will make great provisions for those districts who were not able to participate in extravaganza, and I'm sure we'll be very excited about the news that comes out of it. So,
I hope so, and I hope that we can, as a country, come together and figure this thing out and get it to a point where we can continue to have normal life and continue to, get to hang out with people and go to church and go to work and
and the Bayou Blast.
and hopefully
Yourself.
the Bayou Blast. We'd love to come if we can. Um, but yeah, but I can't think of somebody better to cheer us up today in this depressing time than you. So we're gonna dive into the word, cause what better thing to do right now than to dive into scripture and to talk more about it, and to try and get a different perspective, verse by verse, phrase by phrase, whatever you want to do. So from here on out, you're gonna run the show. And last time, our first episode of the scripture breakdown, we went through chapter 3, chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 8. This episode, we're going to do 13 and 14. And then we can split it off and do a second episode for chapter 18 if we feel like it tonight. So, if you're ready, let's go.
I'm down. All right. So, like I mentioned previously in the last video, these psalms are like so applicable to interpretation. I had a couple questions about like our first video. Like, what if I thought this is about the psalm? What if I thought this about this verse? And I'm like, that's totally like a valuable, a verified interpretation of that verse. Where I think it means this, you could think it means that, and still be, I think, correct. And I think that's kind of the treasure of the Psalms is that, you know, even in a time like this in our country and in our entire world, you can take a lot of these Psalms and make them very, very personal to you. And I think Psalms chapter 13 is a very, very personal Psalm in David's life. And we'll get into some of the historical context after we're done doing it verse by verse. But he opens it up very, very dramatically, as a lot of his Psalms do open up. And he opens up with a series of questions. So he opens up verse number 1. How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord? Forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? And verse number 2, how long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? So, if you recall in our last video that we made about Psalms chapter number 4, he does a very, very similar thing here in Psalms chapter number 13. How he starts off talking directly to the Lord in order to do something with his conversation to the Lord. So here in Psalms chapter 13, he asks a series of questions. In Psalms chapter 4, he starts off with a request, hear me when I call, O God of my righteousness. So now he's not asking any request at all. He's asking, what are you doing? Why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you hearing my requests at all? So now it's more of a why? Why aren't you listening to what I'm asking and requesting of you? And we saw in Psalms chapter 4 where he used that request to the Lord to then direct a type of dialogue to the sons of men. But here in Psalms chapter 13, he really isn't doing that at all. The whole entire psalm seems to be a discussion to the Lord. And then in verse number 6, he kind of steps back and talks about the Lord in the third person, but he doesn't get there until the end of the very psalm. He never actually addresses the enemy that he's talking about ever in this chapter. And I think that's very important in David's life, that he did not do everything in a sense just to talk about his problems. Obviously, he's talking about his problems here, but he did not do it in a way here to address the very problem directly, head on, first, as if he was the one that was actually going to make the solution happen and the issue go away. He knew exactly where the source of his help had to come from, even if he did not understand why the source of his help was not working on his behalf at this particular time. He knew, obviously, his problem. He knew, obviously, the resolver of his problem, but he did not know how that healer, that one who shifts everything and makes everything come to pass, how he was going to make his problem go away. And so this is kind of that psalm of, I would consider this a psalm of lament. And we know that throughout the Psalms, we have Psalms of praise and Psalms of lament. And what Psalms of lament are is those Psalms of agonizing pain, asking God why. And I think in our Christian walk, we often don't feel at liberty to ask God questions. We don't often feel at liberty to ask God why. And I think a simple skim over the book of Psalms would suggest quite the opposite, that David had questions. And I don't think God ever looked at David's prayers, looked at David's questions, his requests, and looked down upon David as if he was something that was against God or a person against God. He looked at it as simply a part of human nature, a part of our design to ask questions and to ask whenever we didn't get our way, why? Why isn't this seemingly simple solution not being adhered to and followed by our Creator? And so David here is expressing his humanity, I think, in a very, very unique way than we have seen before. We haven't seen this type of, we've seen an emotional David in the Psalms up to this point, but I think this Psalm kind of takes the cake. It starts off with these rhetorical questions because in David's mind, it's not really rhetorical because it feels like God is forsaking him. He's just asking it to hopefully get a response. Mm-hmm. But David in his mind thinks that God has forsaken him forever. And so he shifts And we talked about last time the importance of the couplet in Hebrew poetry, how that, yeah, you'll have 2 lines of poetry, and then those next 2 lines will either, complement or contrast those first 2 lines, or even in the couplet itself, you'll have a comparison or a contrast. And so then he shifts in the second couplet in verse number 3, and he starts giving more requests. He says he's asking these questions. Now he's giving these requests. So you can see how this could shift in quizzing in a type of direct question or multi-part, what questions and what requests are made to the Lord in the first 3 verses of Psalms chapter 13. So he says, consider and hear me, O Lord, my God. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. Verse number 4, lest mine enemies say I have prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. Okay, so we have how many requests here? We have consider and hear me. Those are 2 requests.
Mm-hmm.
Lighten mine eyes. So that's the 3rd request.
And that's a why, right?
Yeah. Okay. So this is really important. It's a POI, right? So what does the why refer to? What request?
Only lighten mine eyes.
Good job. So the why does not extend to the consider and hear me, O Lord my God.
Right, but the why does continue into. Sorry, I need to stay in the mic. The why does continue into verse 4.
Right. So a question writer could ask, "Lighten mine eyes, why?" and ask you to go into verse number 4 and finish out your answer. Yeah.
Right, and that also is a statement, and which is something that, especially junior quizzers coming up, it's strange to them to study punctuation, but there's so few of these in Psalms that it's really a great year to get used to studying punctuation. These verses that are connected and don't have ending punctuation at the end of verse 3. Verse 3 and verse 4 entirely, in its entirety, is one statement. So if it's quote the statement that mentions the sleep of death, you need to quote verse 3 and 4.
Right.
So,
and also, like, I would, add to that if you're going to have a 30-point quotation or a 30-point direct that asks what statement or quote the statement that contains blah, 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 you're almost going to look for verses that continue on.
Right.
And because there are so few of them, like you mentioned, it is worth going chapter by chapter and figuring out what statement, what question, what exclamation continues on or spans over more than one verse, because it will be asked. Because a little tip for like anyone who's trying to write questions or trying to figure out questions, it is so hard to make a direct 30 in the book of Psalms, much less over one verse. But like to figure out a direct 30 over multiple verses is challenging enough. So whenever you see a statement that spans more than one verse, that is cake for you to study and to get right for a 30-point question. I know you and Dylan mentioned 30-point questions in y'all's last podcast, so I'm sure that will come into play, all that information there as well. All right, so a couple of semantic things. Obviously, I think a great habit whenever you're learning verses or trying to figure out what someone is saying. The KJV does not put quotation marks in the study. So I would go back and I would like manually put in quotation marks of where it began and where it ended. So like, for example, in verse number 4, the quotation marks would begin, lest mine enemies say, open quotes, I prevailed against him, close quotes, because a question could very well ask, quote what mine enemy say in verse 4 of Psalms chapter 13. And if you're not prepared for that type of question, you may very well just go through the entire verse without, and I think this verse is kind of easy and self-explanatory, but some verses in Psalms aren't. For example, like in Psalms chapter 40 with, then said I, low icon in the volume of the book. Yeah. So like, unless you have studied that or read the POI,
right.
You have probably missed that question. So I think it is very important and crucial for quizzers to start putting quotation marks. Like just print out, a simple black and white copy of your verses and just go through and just spend time opening and closing quotes, and that will solve a lot of your quotation questions right off the bat.
I have enjoyed seeing our quizzers grow in practice where, we'll have a question on a verse or something will happen and they'll be like, hey, what is that? They'll just be like, hey, is that saying this or this? And then we just take a moment and we stop and we look it up in different translations and we try and figure it out. And when there's a group discussion and we all kind of discover it together, I feel like it's more memorable and they retain it and they
Yeah,
remember it.
conversation does that. What you talk about and learn in a conversation mode, I think, goes 10 times far beyond what you just memorize or study by yourself. So yeah, in your quiz practices, it helps and it will provide treasures beyond measure if you just sat down and went through the verses and talked about some things that are not so out there and just write black and white in front of your face, but actually like figure out what does that this refer to. What, like, for example, we'll get to this later on in chapter 24, but this is the generation of them that seek him. What is the this, because that just sounds like whatever this, but unless a question actually prompts you to answer that question, to what does this refer? If you're not prepared to answer that question, then you can't answer it in 30 seconds and roll with it, right? So also just like talking about like a literature standpoint in these two verses, the phrase lighten mine eyes, what do you think, Phil, whenever you hear that phrase, lighten mine eyes?
Well, to be honest, I've never really given it a ton of thought. Lighten mine eyes. Does that I don't know. What does it mean, Eric?
So this is really cool, and I kind of like pick up with Ephesians chapter 1 in this verse, because Paul, like, it almost seems like he hyperlinks the Psalms a lot in his writings. And let me pull that up. It's like he's talking to the Ephesian church, and the Ephesian church in the New Testament was like the church. Like, if you were going to model your church after anything, especially in terms of doctrine, this was the church that you were going to model your church after. And basically, he asks, or he requests, he prays to God in Ephesians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18. He says, that the God of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of glory, may give unto you the spirit of wisdom and revelation in the knowledge of him. He's praying for the spirit of wisdom and revelation for the church that had Timothy, for the church that had Priscilla, Aquila, all these like heroes of the faith who knew the word, but yet he's still praying for revelation. And then he says, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened, that ye may know what is the hope of his calling, and what the riches of the glory of his inheritance in the saints, and what is the exceeding greatness of his power to usward who believe, according to the working of his mighty power. He says in verse number 18, the eyes of your understanding being enlightened. And like I mentioned, for someone who is doctrinally sound, Paul prayed that their understanding be enlightened. David was someone I feel like who relates to, or Paul probably relates to David in his life right here in Psalms chapter 13. David was someone who obviously knew the law, who could quote the law, who knew the Torah, but he made a distinction between knowledge and understanding. And he said, it's not enough for me to know that you provided for Abraham, that you provided for Moses, that you did all these things for the patriarchs. Because right now I feel forsaken. Right now, I don't feel like their story matches up with what my life is and my narrative is in my current state. So he's asking, because I'm questioning God, because of my doubt, because of my unbelief, here are my requests that match that unbelief. Lighten mine eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. People look at this and they think, okay, he's running from Saul, whatever, he's about to die. While I think that is a part of what he's saying here, I think he's saying something very, very much more profound. And I think he's saying, spiritually, enlighten mine eyes, lest I fall from where you have called me to be in this particular state in my life, even if it is running away from Saul, from my enemy, that I would find anointing in my place in this time, and that I would see your hand working in the middle of my struggles. And I think that's what he's praying for, and what Paul picks up in Ephesians chapter 1, that his eyes would be enlightened with understanding, to see the hand and the work of God in his current state of running away from Saul, his enemy. And I think that's really, really important because and then he says, the why here is, of course, lest I sleep the sleep of death, lest mine enemies say I prevailed against him, and those that trouble me rejoice when I am moved. So he's saying basically, if I don't get the spiritual understanding correct first, I will be overtaken by Saul. My throne will be overpowered. Everything that I have in the physical will just be diminished and demolished and basically reduced to nothing if I don't get what is really fundamental right first. And that's why I love David in this chapter, because he goes from questioning, he gives himself the space to question God, but he does not allow himself to stay in that space of questioning, because he then requests God to pick him up out of his doubt and to actually bring him to a bird's eye view of what his entire life is in the moment. That's why I have a lot of respect for David, because he's not naive, he's not fake, but he's also not a Debbie Downer and lets himself stay in despair. So me and David are kind of homeboys. You can't tell.
You and Paul and David and John and Mark.
Yeah, all the guys.
Well,
but then, sorry.
No, I love this. This is very enlightening. I mean, and no pun intended. It really is. This is and it's a really good chapter for, I think, how a lot of people are feeling right now.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and like David, allow yourself to question why, but just don't stay there, right?
Before we got started, you're like, "Oh, we'll run through chapter 13. I don't have a lot to say." Yeah, okay, that wasn't true.
I forgot about the Ephesians hyperlink there. So
that was awesome. All right.
Yeah. Verse number 5, and then after he requests, it's funny. It's like, I'm questioning you because I don't see your hand at all in my life. Then I'm requesting God, get me out of my funk. And then it's like, okay, wait, but I have seen you in my past. I've trusted in your mercy. My heart shall rejoice in your salvation. So my past is that I have done this. I've trusted in thy mercy. Now my future will then be, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. So it's like he gives his current state in like the first, 4 verses. He gives his past and his future in the 5th verse. And in the 6th verse, he also gives a part of the future as well. I will sing unto the Lord, because in the present he hath dealt bountifully with me. And so he's doing a lot. He's saying basically that even if I don't feel you working right now in the current, your past has been faithful. Your character has been proven true in my past. Whenever you brought me to the throne of Israel, whenever I was just a shepherd boy, you exalted me in due time. Because of my past, despite my present, my future will rejoice in your salvation, and I will sing unto the Lord. And then he says, but wait, even in the present, you have dealt bountifully with me. And from if you're just mapping this out logically, it almost sounds like a contradiction. It's like, wait, David, I thought the Lord has forgotten you in verses 1 and 2, right, and now he's saying he's dealt bountifully with me. And it's like, that's not a contradiction at all, because you can feel forgotten, you can feel forsaken, but it's coming to that realization in verse number 6 that whenever you step back and look at your life in the span of God's timeline, that you say, actually, despite what I'm feeling, my faith is not in feeling at all. And that's why I'm a stickler for saying that faith is not a leap in the dark. Faith is not just, let's just do this and whatever happens, happens. Faith by nature is actually a very, very logical thing. I think of Hebrews chapter 11, whenever the writer of Hebrews gives all these accounts of by faith, this person did this, by faith, this person did this. Then he steps back and he says, and these all, having obtained the promise, they died in faith, God having provided some better thing for us, that they without us should not be made perfect. Basically, what he's saying is because all of these people who are now the cloud of witnesses in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1, they did all this by faith, by logic, and by reasoning. Therefore, I can do the same thing through faith. He's saying because God has showed up in all these people's lives, I can now continue to walk in the faith of Jesus Christ in the current and in the future because of that. And David's here kind of having the same realization. He's saying, because I've seen you move in my past, and even in my current, whenever I don't feel you moving, I have the confidence and the faith that in the future I will sing your praise forever because you will be faithful in the future as well. And that's awesome, I think, because it begins with a lamenting nature, a lamenting tone, and then it ends with a song of praise that he will sing unto the Lord forever because he had dealt bountifully with me. So really beautiful, actually.
It's beautiful how you can just feel his spirit completely turn from verse 1 to verse 6.
Yeah.
And how he completely turns himself around. I love this chapter a lot more now.
And also, like, if you step back, I mean, and thank God for the forebears little historical blurbs. This is whenever in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verses 6 through 16. It's a really interesting story. David's like coming in back to Jerusalem, walking through the streets, and this woman just starts like coming out the street and was like, Saul has killed thousands, but David has killed 10,000s upon 10,000s, and this makes Saul angry. And he according to the Bible, he gets this evil spirit perplexed inside of him to then want to kill David rather. And it's interesting because David here should feel loved by the people, and yet the person that he's eventually going to take the throne from is trying to kill him. Right. And it's like in the middle of this, God, I'm in the eyes of the people, I have favor, but in the eyes of the person that has the most say in the kingdom, I'm hated. And so he's in a state of in between of I feel forsaken, but I also feel loved at the same time. And you can feel that tone of David in this psalm. So I think the history bears record of that as well.
Well, thank you so much for sharing. I mean, you obviously have done a ton of research, and you're so knowledgeable, and I really, really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us. So we went 30 minutes on chapter 13. So I said this was going to be on 13 and 14, but I think we should cut this off and just do a separate podcast for chapter 14. So with all that being said, everyone watching, please check out our first one if you haven't, on 3, 4, 5, and 8 chapters of Psalms. And check us out because we're going to be posting one on chapter 14 and one on 18, and we're going to keep going as long as we can. So thank you guys.
Thank y'all.